Hello, folks. Welcome back to English 408, Introduction to Literary Criticism. This is going to be a video lecture for Module 2 over structuralism, which will form your worksheet number 2 that is due a week from today, January 24th. If you scroll down in the syllabus, you'll see here all of the readings listed, all of which are already available in our course drive. So here's the course drive folder. And last week we discussed new criticism for worksheet 1. This week we'll discuss structuralism for worksheet 2. And all of the images, documents, readings are in this structuralism folder. If you toggle this Google Drive button from the list view, you can go to the grid view and vice versa. So these are the things we will be discussing and you have access to freely. Okay, so I'm going to proceed in this order here. And it's pretty dense and intense reading. A lot of it is, again, kind of philosophical or philosophy based. So need to cover some of that. So the handout, Barry's chapter on structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure's excerpt from Course in General Linguistics, Lévi-Strauss's The Structural Study of Myth, and then a couple of helpful other documents. All right. So I'd like to begin with a handout, as I call it, or the approach of structuralism, or the approach of last week, liberal humanism / new criticism. A little handout that kind of distills the basic ideas and concepts down to a couple of pages. So we're going to move or shift from the humanist model to the structuralist model. And if we remember last week about new criticism or liberal humanism, as it was called in Britain, they believe that language is a product of the author's mind. Think of Eliot in the Tradition and Individual Talent essay, focusing heavily on what has been said before, but what the author is currently saying, right? So coming from an individual being, right, or self. The structuralist model, however, shifts fairly radically, and it presupposes that rather than understanding our meaning or poem, whatever, through the author's mind, in this case, we can only understand the world through language, that no ideas pre-exist language. I'd say here, compare, that's the Latin abbreviation for compare or conferre. So compare, think about Plato's forms in the Republic. So in one of several Platonic dialogues, Plato discusses this idea of the forms, and very kind of simply put, he believes that the true or absolute nature of something, whether it's a chair or a table, a cat, does not exist tangibly in the world as we feel it, see it, touch it, but instead it exists in our minds. And this will be important when we talk in a moment about Saussure's notion of the sign. So structuralists also believe that the structure of language produces or constitutes reality. Therefore, the world is made up of signs, which is a combination of signifier plus the signified, which equals the sign. And thought cannot exist without language. So think about that for a second. Like, can you have a thought without having the language to understand it in your own mind, much less to convey it to someone else? Structuralists would, of course, say no. And thirdly, structuralists believe that meaning in reality, therefore, does not come from individuals like the new critics thought, but from structures that govern what any individual can do within that structure. And that could be language itself, it could be a genre, it could be a sentence. And I'm going to come back to this this page or image here, but this is what we're kind of going to be talking about when they talk about deep structures of language. That's a fairly radical shift from last week's new criticism. What I then start to do in this handout is break down the individual authors we're going to talk about, particularly Strauss and Saussure and Lévi-Strauss. They assume that the mind or human mind is a structuring mechanism. And like Kant, Immanuel Kant, and his Critique of Pure Reason, he believed, Kant, that the mind tries to automatically make sense of that which it doesn't understand. So the noumena and phenomena of, say, time and space, what he calls categorical imperatives, we don't fully really understand them. We can kind of quantify them with physics and mathematical calculations, but they're really, after all, human constructs, right? If you think about a watch, you know, that's not time in terms of, you know, solar time, like, you know, the sunrise and sunset. It's an artificially produced construct, but that's what the human mind does, according to structuralists. Tries to make sense of that which it doesn't understand through structures. Underlying or deep structures exist in the world and are universal because the human mind structures them so. That is perception, therefore order. We have a perception of something, and therefore that helps order our reality. You know, you are asleep and you wake up and you open your eyes and you perceive the room in which you're in, and you begin to understand that there's order in the world because, oh, there's a roof, there are walls, there's a bed, and so on. And we sort of need that kind of order in our lives. For Saussure, this would be equivalent to langue, or that's the French word, that's kind of where we also get the word language, be equivalent to langue, or a system which governs language, okay? A group, community, or society establishes arbitrarily the rules of this system through convention and consensus. So let me go back to this over here, and this again is in your structuralism folder. So here's an example of what is being talked about in terms of the deep structure of language. In English, for example, we have this SVO, or subject verb object, deep structure of a language. I gave flowers, subject, verb, object, right? Right here, I gave flowers. And that helps us make sense of, you know, the world. It orders meaning for us, if you will. But Saussure calls that langue, or a deep structure. Inside of, and it's equivalent up here to grammar or rules, right? The deep structure of something. And inside of this langue or deep structure are individual utterances. I gave flowers. And those are individual utterances that are, he calls parole, to use the French. So it's an individual unit, if you will, within the larger structure of langue. The example I'm using up here is, say, literary history. The large, grammar or rules of what we as, English majors and professors and so on call the trajectory of literary history. In this handout I showed you last time in the new criticism folder, right? So beginning from, the early Anglo-Saxon period, there's Beowulf through Chaucer and so on, progressing. But there's Hamlet, for example. And so Hamlet as a text and the larger trajectory of literary history, Hamlet is an example of an utterance or parole, or each one of these works is an utterance or like parole in the larger structure of this analogy, the larger structure of literary history, or what Saussure calls langue. So langue is the bigger, deeper, larger structure, and parole is an individual unit or utterance inside of langue. So structures consist of units, for example, phonemes, morphemes, and semantines. These are if you've taken the history of English language, maybe you've been introduced to these. These are the sort of constituent individual units that make up sound, letters, sounds, and phrases and sentences for us in the larger system we call language. So grammar, syntax, usage, right? These are all units inside of language. For Saussure, this would be equivalent to parole, that is phonemes, morphemes, phonemes. Those are individual kind of units. And so parole is any and all possible combinations of utterances in a language system. Yes, this is complicated. This is a little intense. I'll break down further as we get into this video discussion. So what structuralism does is it tries to use structures or deep structures to understand that which we think we already understand, like language or mythology or other kinds of cultural expressions, but it does so through an examination of how a system of structures functions. So if you've read the Berry chapter or read the Berry chapter, this one here on structuralism, he uses further in the chapter the example of Edgar Allan Poe's The Oval Portrait, which I asked you all to read for last week, because we'll return to it again and again throughout the semester. And in doing so and examining the, let me just find it here for you. The example that he's using is looking at the short story as a deep structure, right? So this is on page 52, right? So he's going to apply some of the principles of structuralism to this particular short story. And one of which is to think of the narrative structure of that story, right? There's, as he says, a story within a story, right? And so you can do that by looking at, parallels and echoes and reflections inside of the plot structure and so on. So going back to the handout, structuralism views itself as a science, right? And certainly new criticism did not think of itself as a science in that kind of proper sense of the word. But structuralism wants to try to look objectively, like science does, at whether it's individual work like Hamlet, or genres of, say, tragedies, or the larger expression of drama in general. Wants to look at it sort of at a distance and say, okay, what are some patterns we can recognize here in terms of structures apparent? One common tool, if you will, for structuralists is to think of oppositions or dyads, Barry will call them, right? So I've just listed many here, that is dyads or dichotomies, binaries that we're familiar with. And this will help us understand what the sign is. The sign is the signified and signifier, but as Saussure will go on to say, it is always in relation to some other sign or some other meaning. And then I should back up and say, really the reason we are starting, or I should say continuing with structuralism here in module 2, is that structuralism then sets us up for the following week, post-structuralism. That is to say, you can't really understand what, say, Derrida and Foucault and others are doing in post-structuralism without understanding what they are sort of arguing against. So it's a little bit of, a binary, structuralism, post-structuralism. And they will, that is the post-structuralists, deconstructionists, they will argue for the difference between the two, the difference, as Derrida says, and we'll talk about later. So a bunch of different binaries. Keep in mind that we just understand that, I was awake because I was not having a dream, right? Or faculty are faculty because they're not students, right? These are all things that we sort of implicitly understand each other by its opposite, or binary. So this takes us into the sign here. And we use the word sign because it comes from the Greek word semiology, which means sign. And so the root of the word, for example, signification, which can also be used for the word meaning, is important to understanding where the origins of the word sign comes from. So Saussure, who is a structural linguistic, so he uses structuralism, but he's using it in a kind of linguistic way, as opposed to Claude Lévi-Strauss, we'll look at in a moment, who's a folklorist, really looking at not language per se, but looking at large swaths of different cultural folklore. Saussure says that the sign is comprised of two things: the sound image and concept. And notice I have those words in quotation mark because they're a bit amorphous, right? So think of the analogy of the front and back of a sheet of paper. They're distinguishable yet inseparable. Or you could say a coin, right? Heads and tails, but you can't have one without the other. Therefore, it's not a coin. You could cut the head off or the tail side off or sand it down or whatever, but it would be a one-sided coin. It would still be a coin or a sign in this case. So these two things, the sound image and concept, are defined by Saussure as the signifier, which is the sound image, And notice again, it's in quotation marks. So it's not the physical sound that your mouth makes or your ear hears, but it's a psychological imprint or impression the sound makes. So as soon as I say the word cat, that has triggered a sound image or a psychological imprint in your brain. And you may have a particular, cat in mind. Like, when I think of cat, the generic cat, I think of our black cat when I was growing up as a child with the, brilliant name Blackie, because he was an entirely black cat. I don't know if I or my brothers named him, but, that's what his name was. And so, cat, this whatever cat, or you could think of a kind of outline, cartoonish caricature of a cat, but whatever you have in your head, that is the sound image or psychological imprint. Now, the signified or the concept, right, is a perception triggered by the sound image. For example, the sound image for tree, if someone said tree, in any given language will automatically conjure up the concept for tree in that language. And this becomes a little bit tricky because, excuse me, as he's going to show us or tell us, the word tree is English, right? But if someone said arbor, which is the French word, you might be thinking about Arbor Day, which is a holiday, celebrating trees in the United States. Or he also uses the example of dog. For us, that might conjure up any sort of number of sound images of dogs, right? But the signified, the thing that it's sort of pointing to out onto the world, is not necessarily dog in any other language. So in Spanish it's perro, in French it's chien, in German it's Hund. And so you have to wonder why. It's all the same creature, could be the exact same creature for that matter, that you're all looking at, but that concept is not fixed. And he will tell us, therefore, that language and the sign is relational, or language exists in relationality. So let's move on here to, I'll come back to the sign as we look at Saussure. The association between signifier and signified is completely arbitrary or predetermined by convention. Right, so he doesn't mean arbitrary in roll the dice kind of thing, but he means, as it says here, by convention, by consensual agreement from any society. Okay, Saussure's usage of arbitrary here means that which is, quote, derived from mere opinion or preference, not based on the nature of things, hence capricious, uncertain, varying. For example, there is no logical relation between sound image and concept in different languages for the same thing, which I just mentioned, right? There isn't, it's just like each one of these cultures has agreed that, here's the sound and here's what it points to, the same object or thing, creature. So this abbreviation is nota bene, meaning note well or take good notice of. This property, that is, being able to separate the signifier and the signified, or to change the relation between them, makes possible the idea that a single signifier could be associated with more than one signified, or vice versa, producing ambiguity and multiplicity of meaning, which deconstructionists like Derrida next week or so will welcome as difference and the slipperiness of language. And what I mean by that is what I was referring to a moment ago. If someone said cat or dog or man or woman or whatever, sound image is being imprinted psychologically for you, we can all conjure up, and probably do conjure up, all quite different colors, shapes, sizes of those creatures. And therefore, the post-structuralists and deconstructionists like Derrida will key on that notion that language is not fixed, basically. Okay. So there's a thing here that is used for Saussure that then Lévi-Strauss takes up, this notion of synchronic and diachronic. Synchronic is only present at the moment. Think of the word I in the sentence, I gave flowers, right? It only exists at one point in time. Only in that present moment you're saying it. Therefore, it's synchronic. And diachronic is looking at, sort of trajectory from beginning to end in a kind of chronological way. So if I go back to this page here, right? This sentence here, I gave flowers, right? Each one of these is synchronic, okay? Because each one of these words exists in its own, what we call a syntactical slot, or paradigmatic slot, to use Saussure's word. A paradigm, of course, being a model. In other words, you could change each one of these words out. You could say, she stole money, right? So it's still the larger structure of subject, verb, object in language, or it's what Saussure calls long, the deep structure of language. But the individual utterance, or as he calls it, the parole, right, can be changed out. So they donated food, right? Each one is an individual utterance inside of a larger structure. Just like in terms of literary history, the larger structure of, cultural expression and written form, Hamlet is only a single utterance, and you could come up with many other utterances or examples for literary history, as I showed you with that timeline. So back to the handout. So Claude Lévi-Strauss here, notice he is not like Saussure, a linguist, but he's a folklorist or anthropologist applying the principles of structure and structuralism to the interpretation of folklore and myth. So he says that myth is similar to language, and you can disagree with him. In fact, that's one of the possible questions, right? So this is module 2, worksheet 2. The first question is about Saussure and the value of the linguistic sign, which we will talk more about. So first of all, you have to understand what a sign is, and then understand, what does Saussure, mean by value when it comes to the sign or to language. But when it comes to Lévi-Strauss, he's basically going to argue that myth constitutes or creates language. And I'm asking, do you agree with that? You can say yes, no, or it depends, but you need to explain why. And then I ask if you agree with it, right? So are there other cultural forms of expression like art, politics, feminism, religion that constitute or create their own languages? If so, give some examples of that. So Lévi-Strauss is going to say that myth is similar to language because one, or A, it's comprised of units put together according to certain rules, and he's going to demonstrate that in his article. And it is, it is composed of different discrete units, right? If you're familiar with the Oedipus Rex story, which is the one well, one of the main ones he focuses on in his article, The Structural Study of Myth, this essay. You may recall, if you've read Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, that, there's this prophecy from a blind seer, Tiresias, right? And this prophet Tiresias says that Oedipus, this orphan child, will grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. And once Oedipus hears about that from the prophet, who of course is supposed to be prophesying that, his fate, he does everything he can to reject that fate and runs away from that. And of course, as we know, running away from your fate means you're only running quicker, faster to it. So another example of a unit, if you will, in the Oedipus story is that Oedipus marries his mother Jocasta. Well, in some versions of the tale, depending on when they were written and told, he does not, in fact, marry his mother. Or at the end of the story, we learn that he blinds himself for having killed his father and married his mother. And a certain version of it, he doesn't blind himself, right? So if, according to Lévi-Strauss, myth can be comprised of certain units, sections, if you will, of a myth, then they are put to certain rules, like you can put them at the beginning, the middle, you can shift them around, kind of like a deck of cards. But then he says also the units form relations with each other based on binaries and opposites, like I showed you, which provide the basis of a structure. So what he is kind of invoking here is this notion of relationality, if you will, as I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of the sign. Right here, that meaning of signs comes from an association created between the sound, image, and concept. Therefore, language exists in relationality. And there's another way that language exists in relation. So I'm not sure if I have it on this. Yeah, I don't have it on this one, but on this image here, here's relational meaning that Saussure uses in his course on general linguistics. And Barry also picks up on that each word here exists on its own, but it exists automatically in relation to all of the others. So let's take the word house. So we know what a house is, or at least we think we know what a house is, though your version of house and my version of house or Trump's version of house might differ from person to person. But we also know that without even thinking of it, that a house is automatically, in some ways, fundamentally different from, say, a mansion or a palace. Not just in size, but in grandeur or number of rooms, let's say, in opulence. And certainly, by contrast, a palace is different from a hut or a hovel. If I ask you to distinguish, like, what is a hut versus a hovel, you might be hard pressed to come up with a definition, but there certainly is a generally accepted definition. Whereas a hut might, be something that is very, very like a lean-to, you might say, very, very structurally unsound. A hovel is a little more perhaps enclosed. It might have, 3 walls, or might be entirely closed in. But my point here is that each one of these words differs automatically from all of the other words that constitute some place of dwelling, right? How does a motel differ from a hotel, right? Or how does a hotel, motel, and resort How do they all differ? But without even having to think of them, we automatically know, as Derrida will say, something by which it is not. So we know that a chateau is a chateau because it's not a mansion, or vice versa. Or going back to the list of oppositions here, dyads, right? We know, or we should know, Donald Trump, what the truth is because it's not fiction, right? We know something that, in this case, is speech versus writing. One comes out of someone's mouth versus someone's, typewritten or published writing. But that isn't always the case, as we will see, when we talk about later in terms of feminism and other issues around gender, male versus female. We think that we know what male is and we know what female is because it's not male. So maybe I should break into some images here to explain what I mean by this. And there are some images that you have in your folder, so go check them out. So this is literally and figuratively a sign. So it's literally, something you might see plastered on the wall. And if you're in need of using the restroom, you often look for one or either of these symbols. And what we've done is automatically and conventionally as a society or human species kind of said, okay, well, people who have certain body parts and appear a certain way will go into this door or this restroom, and vice versa. People who have certain body parts and appear a certain way will go into this other restroom. Okay. So a second ago when I said male versus female, right? We have these kind of generic, broad, almost stereotypical signs in our head, signified and signifier, of what constitutes male versus female. This is, I think, somewhere in Thailand. So if you weren't sure and you didn't read the language, women versus men, right? There are these outlined silhouette images to say, oh, these people who typically stand up to do their business are men, and these people over here who squat or sit down are women. But you and I both know that this is fairly, arbitrary and in determination that is, human beings can stand up or sit down depending on, what they prefer. It doesn't have anything to do with their biology necessarily. So here's another crazy example. I think this one is from Korea. I could be wrong. A little disturbing, but sort of perhaps joking, which is really not a joke, that there's a separation between male and female. In this case, the lack of privacy that females might have, or people who present as females. This is becoming a little more common. It's what we might call a unisex symbol, right? That any person, regardless of what biology you have, can use this restroom. Because for so long we've been in this sort of, either or model. Or here, you have this preconceived notion that if you see, women's underwear and high heels, you go, oh, well, that's my room, or wait, no, shoes and men's trousers, and oh, that's my room. But again, these signs, literal and figurative, are based on how we consensually agree upon them, right? These are images on the side of the Apollo ship that's out in space. And so this is, again, a kind of very preconceived notion of what constitutes male and female, but of course not all males and females look this way. So if people from outer space see these images, they might come to think, oh, well, this is what all human beings look like, right? Well, it's not true, as we certainly know nowadays. Again, we have these different cultural representations all over the planet, signs, literally and figuratively. Here's one, actually, it's in Boulder. It's at a bar. It's a little tricky, right? Because if you're going to the restroom and you maybe have had one too many, and you see this, man's pants leg and shoe and big hand, you're going to walk into this on the right side, but you can see the arrow, the hand is pointing to this side. And likewise, you see a woman's, skirt and leg and high heel. And if you're not up on your game, you think, oh, I don't want to go into the women's restroom, so I'll go over here. Well, if you go over here on the right side, you actually going into the women's, right, as this hand shows, right? So the very letters here that signify men and women, right, are telling us through language that this is what constitutes your reality. Okay, it's not the leg or the skirt or whatever, the high heel, that is, telling you. It's the actual letters that we then, put together in a kind of mental structure and make sense of, make an ordered world out of. So let me get back to these, to the handout here with Lévi-Strauss. He is going to, taking up Saussure's notion of langue and parole, he's going to kind of co-opt, or we might say, appropriate the langue and parole idea that Saussure sets up. Remember, langue is the deep structure of a language, parole is the individual utterance in a language, or structure. And he's going to apply that langue and parole here to what we would otherwise call diachronic and synchronic, or a timelessness of myth, or a stuck in time kind of specific utterance of myth. And I guess to quickly make sense of that, so langue, again, deep structure that is going to be sort of akin to, Lévi-Strauss says, the diachronic, which is an ahistorical structure. That myth is timeless. Think of just a timeline going from left to right, and in infinity. And that parole, individual unit within the larger structure, he's going to equate with synchronic, which is a specific utterance or event in Lévi-Strauss's idea, event of myth in the larger structure or story of myth. So there's an image here of, where is it? In case you're wondering what the background screen is, I have a rotating background images, and this is an image from Charlottesville. So where is it? So it's here. This is going to come from page 433 of Claude Lévi-Strauss's The Structural Study of Myth. And the page itself, if I go to it here. So here's the, again, you have this in your folder. Original appeared, Journal of American Folklore, 1955. This appears on page 433, but doesn't look like that in the reading, right? So it just looks like this, like a sort of, unmarked page. But what he is doing, as I mentioned a moment ago, is he's taking here individual units of the story of Oedipus, right? So all of these ones constitute a particular version of Oedipus. And a one here is like, oh, okay, this particular unit fits in this category, left to right. And as you can see, that not all of the units of the story of Oedipus appear in every single version, right? So this top version here, this top version here only has 1, 2, 4, 7, and 8. So it's missing 3, 5, and 7. And therefore, the story, as far as we know, isn't really complete. And, you can just go down and see how many of these are obviously incomplete versions, if you will. And so for his purposes, he's looking at, again, the larger structure of, in this case, the Oedipus story, and he lays it out here, right? So, in one version, you have Oedipus kills his father, Laos, right? Which in, the Sophocles version happens. But then in this version right below it, right there, there's this blank space here because we don't have Oedipus killing his father. Or in this version, we have Oedipus marrying his mother, Jocasta, as I mentioned earlier. But in these previous versions up here, we don't. Instead, we have, in this early version, Cadmus seeks his sister Europa, who's ravished by Zeus. So there is some, sexual intercourse going on, both here with Oedipus and his mother Jocasta, and here with Zeus and Europa, but not the same characters, right? Anyhow, on page 433, what I've done with this image is shown you what Claude Lévi-Strauss is trying to do here, okay? So each box, if you will, because I put boxes around all of these, is equivalent to a linguistic utterance or parole. And diachronic is this kind of, timeless, he says, think of infinity, left to right kind of version. And then over here on the side, parole is this non-reversible because it, like I gave flowers. You can't go back and take those words back once they come out of your mouth, right? So think of this kind of, top-down column as an utterance like I gave flowers, right? And so what Lévi-Strauss is trying to say here is that because we can apply the structuralist idea of long and parole, of a deep structure, long, and the individual utterance, parole, to the study of myth, in this case, particular Oedipus, that therefore it makes us make sense of the Oedipus story or stories, plural. And therefore, what's his name? Claude Lévi-Strauss says that therefore myth constitutes language, like we can read it and understand it like language, right? Right here, you take a myth and reduce it to its smallest unit. It's mytheme, he calls it, right? That's his process. So Yeah, that's his method. And then I end here by saying, because it's kind of important to understand between the two, Saussure and Lévi-Strauss, that Lévi-Strauss's approach differs from Saussure's because whereas Saussure was interested in analyzing relation between signs in the structure of language, Lévi-Strauss was interested in analyzing sets of relations, or what he calls bundles of relations, rather than individual relations. So they're both using structure and deep structure, but one is applying them to language and one is applying them to myth, which Lévi-Strauss will call language. So looking at Berry, remember Berry is your sort of, primer, if you will, to understanding whatever theoretical approach we're talking about. He tells us that, Berry does that it begins in the 1950s in France, part of which, by the way, it's difficult to understand these authors that I mentioned earlier, or Berry did really, that a lot of this is philosophy written in French that's then translated into different languages like English. So there's quite literally sometimes some nuance lost in translation. We'll come to Roland Barthes next time and look at The Death of an Author essay. But for this week, we're focusing on Saussure and Lévi-Strauss. So let me give you an example, or use Berry's example of what he talks about when he's talking about the sign and langue and parole. He talks about both the franc, or the coin, the French franc, and fashion. So here's where he had mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier, about the arbitrariness of language, that we agree to it by convention. Like he says here, the word hut, for instance, is in no way appropriate to its meaning, and all linguistic signs are arbitrary like this. Like, we just consensually agreed as English-speaking people that, oh, these three letters, hut, and this sound is going to trigger in our heads the psychological imprint or sound image of this thing out in the world that we all generally might call a hut. So here's the relational again. It's the same thing I just showed you in the other image. All of these exist in relation to each other. And you don't need to really, if you're talking about a palace, Versailles in France, let's say, the Prime Minister's Palace or Buckingham Palace in London, you don't have to automatically say, well, I'm talking about Buckingham Palace. I'm not talking about so-and-so's mansion or your house or that hut or a shed or so on, right? I'm talking about this particular thing, but it automatically, the palace, word palace, means that all of these others are sort of present by their absence, if you will, as Derrida says. That is, they're automatically there in the background without us having to say it, which is what this paragraph is explaining. We define mansion by explaining how it relates to that of the two words on either side of it, right? It's, opposites or dyads. So he uses the example here of the train, talking about the 825 train. The reason we know it's the 825 train is because you're going to say it because it's between 725 and 925, right? That it's automatically different from the other two. Oh, this is important, by the way, in terms of arbitrariness and how language constitutes the world. It has to do with, as the deconstructionists and post-structuralists will say next time, has to do with really often who's connoting or who's defining the word, right? So one person's terrorist might be another person's freedom fighter. For example, we might, the United States or Western culture, might say the people in Syria and Iraq, known as ISIS or ISIL, are terrorists. But within their own community, they might define themselves as freedom fighters, fighting for their freedom to practice this particular religion. So it's important to know who's doing the connoting, the signification. Let's see, where is that example of the Franck? Here he's talking about Lévi-Strauss and Oedipus, of course. Let me just find this. Oops. So what I want you to do here is, again, go back to, see here, this notion of long and pearl, right? The deep rules of something versus the utterance of something. And so what Barry's going to do here is, rather than say literary history, you know, the broad swath of literary history, in this case, British and American literature, and the particular utterance of Hamlet, he instead is going to use fashion as the broad, you know, kind of rule or long. And as an individual parole or individual utterance would be that someone wears a particular piece of clothing or attire, shoes or whatnot. So he's going to say here, for instance, fashion, for instance, can be read like language. Separate items or features are added up into a complete outfit or look with complex grammatical rules of combination, which is pretty much true in conventional society. We don't wear an evening dress and carpet slippers, right? If we're wearing an evening dress, we wear shoes to match. Or if we're wearing carpet slippers, or what we might say house slippers or fuzzy slippers, you know, we might be wearing pajamas and not a evening dress. We don't come to lectures in military uniform, right? Typically. Of course, many fashions in clothing depend on breaking such rules in a knowing way, right? Like you're deliberately flouting convention by, as he says, you know, like wearing, as Madonna did, you know, a bra on the outside of your clothing. Something that you would wear on the inside is now worn on the outside as a fashion statement. But the statement made by such rules breaks, for instance, making outer garments which look like undergarments, or cutting expensive fabrics in an apparently rough way, which many I've noticed people do. You know, their jeans or buy jeans that look, you know, all rough and cut, for which you pay more apparently, depends upon the prior existence of the rule or convention which is being conspicuously flouted. So if you know, see, let me just find an image here. So if you see jeans like this, which I have seen many students wear, it's a deliberate fashion statement, right? But it's predicated on knowing what actual uncut genes look like, So it's, predicated on knowing that, oh, well, genes look like this, but I'm going to, deliberately break that convention and, cut them somehow. So it's a knowing way to say, I know what the long is, I know what the deep structure is that genes look like this, but I'm going to have a particular utterance, particular moment, if you will, of having genes look like that. So these structures, right, as you can see, whether it's myth or fashion, literary history can be applied in many different ways. It's a kind of, in some ways, useful technique. So let's look at, here's where he's talking about it being translated. Let's look at Saussure. And it's from his course in general linguistics. And unfortunately, Saussure wrote this down. And this a bit of part of the, fragmented nature of it is that it's compiled by his students who were in his class. But, we kind of get the gist, basically. So you have here again, the kind of definition. These are the Norton anthology editors. Language for Saussure is a structured system of conventional signs studied in their internal complexity as if frozen in time, synchronically frozen in time, like I gave flowers, because again, you can never take those words back once you've said them, rather than as time changing, or rather than as changing over time or diachronically. And here's where we're talking about, or they're talking about the signifier, the sound image, and the concept itself. So the question that I pose in letter A here for module 2 is, how is the value of a linguistic sign determined? Or how do we distinguish between value and meaning or signification, according to Saussure, right? So they're kind of telling you here, the editors, before you dive into the actual reading, though the signifier and the signified seem to function together as a unit to produce meaning or signification, you can use that word interchangeably, each has value only by virtue of the ways in which it differs from other terms, right? So the signifier and the signified, the sound image and the concept, each has value by virtue that it differs from other terms. So the sound image of a tree versus the sound image of a cat, right? They're automatically different because, well, they conjure up different things, but they have value to us in terms of meaning or signification because there is difference. They go on to say, Saussure's distinction between signification and value is similar to Karl Marx, and we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Karl Marx's distinction between use value and exchange value. The first, meaning signification or meaning, the first appears to be tied to the characteristics of the object or term, like tree, okay? And then value, the second here, whereas the second, or value, is entirely a function of the system of exchange or of language. That is, we get value by understanding that a tree is not a cat. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Saussure goes so far as to say that everything in language is relational, by saying, quote, in language, there are only differences. Even more important a difference generally implies positive terms between which the difference is set up. But in language, there's only differences without positive terms. And he doesn't mean necessarily here like good or evil positive. He means that if something is positive, it points to some kind of outward meaning, therefore order or understandability, if you will. But if it's without positive terms, then it's sort of inert by itself. I mean, one thing that I've said over the past is, so imagine this. I'm going to type in the word chronometer, which is what you would call a fancy watch like a Rolex, okay? Or really any watch for that matter. Here, there's a bunch of timepieces. But let's say, hypothetically, there's some native peoples in Africa or Papua New Guinea or Aboriginal Australians or whoever, right? And they're out there in the desert or wherever they are, and out of a plane overhead, which they cannot see or hear, falls this from the sky. And they see it and they pick it up, discover it doesn't have to, could be left by someone, right? But they come across this thing that they have never ever seen before. Okay. Well, we would know it, right, by that arbitrary and conventional consensual word watch or chronometers. I just typed in for fancy timepiece. But that person who's never seen it before would have no word for it at the moment. However, according to Saussure, what is going to happen immediately, because structuralists believe that the human mind is a structuring mechanism, is that he or she who finds it is immediately going to assign a sign to it. So a sound concept, a sound image and a concept, or what we might call a word. So, if someone says watch, you immediately think of a watch. You think of the physical thing, right? But in your head, you have this sound image, this psychological imprint of what a watch is. And the concept itself is sort of pointing outwardly in your head to this thing, this object. And so that's what the person who's never seen this before will do. They will come up with their own word and syllable or syllables, phonemes, morphemes, to give some kind of meaning and order to this object they've never seen before, so that they in turn can then convey it, communicate it to others. Like, hey, I was in the desert and I found this blank. This what? Blank. Like, what do you mean? What is it? And you have to give it a name. I found this watch, or this, doohickey, right? So back when they're saying here that, or Saussure is saying that in language, there are only differences, but without positive terms, that's what I meant. Like, there's no, for Saussure, there's no kind of preference given to any word over another. They're all sort of inertly their own words, right? And therefore, there's no positivity in that sense. Sort of a difficult way to use the word positive. Here's a good example that they use based on, linguistic pronunciation and difference. But, for us, the example makes sense. Okay. They're talking about jokes here. A homeowner answering the phone and hearing that the viper is coming might feel fear. But when the voice on the line explains that he is coming to vipe your windows, what has initially been a serpent comes a benign household maintenance worker. A foreign accent changes the sound in a language without changing the system of differences. The sound V, like you might have from, say, a German Australian speaker who switches V's and W's, because they do that. The sound V takes on a differential role of W in this joke as soon as it becomes clear as to what is being opposed. So in this example, the word viper, right, in your head, the sound image of, a serpent is triggered, but then put into broader context with the next sentence, he's coming to vipe your windows. Well, a serpent can't vipe your windows, right? You sort of immediately get like, oh, in place of this verb to vipe, right? Think of here the subject verb object, right? And this parole and this utterance. So instead of gave here, we have the word vipe, right? So we just sort of understand it, right? Because we have this deep structure of language, right? Subject, verb, object, or direct, indirect object too, with the infinitive phrase. So this is the introduction. Let me just get to Saussure himself. So it begins by talking about language in general, how children assimilate language, right? And, if you have children, or, we were all children, and remember your childhood, and you see around children, they are constantly sponges absorbing how we speak, our language pattern, inflection, pronunciation, intonation, everything, right? And then they often end up speaking like their parents. In fact, parents are, children's or our, greatest linguistic role models. And so in the acquisition of language, which happens the first couple of years, children are constantly being reinforced with the right sound, phoneme, morpheme, and syntagmeme is, so the right, letters, if you will, the right, syllables, the right order in which you put the syllables, the right order in which you put the words, and so on. So, we don't say dama. The child doesn't say dama. The child either says dada or mama, right? They don't mix the two, dama, right? Because if they did, looking at, a father figure and said dama, we as parents or adults would correct them, right? And so that's the assimilation of language as children, but and therefore, the consensuality and arbitrariness of language, like, it's okay, the word in our language is dog, not Hund, as it is in German. Language is a social institution, he says. This is where we get the reminder that it comes from the Greek word semeion, meaning sign. So here, the sign, signified, and signifier. So right here, you have the sound image, okay? I'm not going to say the word, right? But you can see it, sound image. And over here, you have the concepts. Of course, remember, this is le français, so it's not T-R-E-E as we might have in English. But that's because the French have agreed to spell and call it that, okay? Or over here, this creature, object, right? That's the sound image we might have in our head, and then the concept. So those things together, or I should say here, those things together are the sign, the signified and the signifier. So he has a lot of language here to describe this. But what I've done is, and here's another image, and these arrows going back and forth, like I said earlier, of a piece of paper or a coin. If you were like spin the coin so fast that it's like, you can't see either side discreetly, it's just one kind of blur. That's exactly how you should think of a sign, is that they're inseparable from each other. You can't have one without the other. And he says here, the two elements are intimately united and each recalls the other. Therefore, that's how you have the sign arrows going up and down. So using this example of the tree, this is on page 853 at the bottom. He's going to say here, I propose to retain the word sign. So he gives the French, signe, the word sign to designate the whole, to designate both things. And that is, this whole thing is the sign, okay? So he says, I'm going to designate the whole thing the sign, and to replace concept. So I have this red arrow here going up here to the top, concept, okay? I'm going to replace the word concept and sound image respectively by signified and signifier. So I have an image here for you to help. It's in the, the Google Drive folder. It's really taken from that page. So the two elements are intimately linked, right? And it's difficult to deny this sign. That is to say, to deny that a sign is both a concept and a sound image. Because as I mentioned a moment ago, like the watch that's in the desert, right? You can't conceive of something without having a word for it, and you can't have a word without the word having reference to what he might call a sound image in your head, right? So it's a pretty powerful paradigm or model. And from this deep structure, signified, signifier, they are basically inseparable. Lévi-Strauss will kind of tag along and apply the deep structure to myth. Let's see here. The bond between the signifier and signified is arbitrary, as I mentioned before, and this is where it gets into that notion of, like in different languages, we call it this, that, and the other. There is, of course, the exception that Barry talks about also, what's called the onomatopoeia. That's how you pronounce that word, onomatopoeia. So, tick-tock, glug-glug. These are words that are meant to approximate a sound that is made, right? Pouring liquid out of a jug, glug, glug, hearing the sound of a clock, tick tock, right? But he also points out that it's not, universal, because in English, for example, we might, in a children's book, see bow wow, the dog saying bow wow, but in French, it's spelled and pronounced ow wow, right? Different spelling, different pronunciation. And so they're approximating what a dog might sound like, but it's not universal. Anyway, language is arbitrary because we all, different cultures, times and places, agree on different things. So language is also relational, he will point out. Here's the section on linguistic value, right? that language only is a system of pure values. And again, values, it's not too difficult. It's that it means it automatically differs from something else and therefore has value to us because we can understand it, have meaning or signification from it because it's not something else. Again, Derrida says, we know something by which it is not. Let's see. So here, how does value differ from signification? This is fundamentally a question I ask right here, right? How do we distinguish value and meaning or signification? Well, everything that occurs, everything that occurs concerns only the sound image and the concept when we look upon the world as independent and self-contained. So that's a pretty simple way of just saying that everything is necessarily dependent on this right here, this called the sign. And then he's going to say language is a system of interdependent, very important word, not independent, but everything is interdependent on each other. A system of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of the other, as in the diagram. And so this diagram here is not really terribly different from this one right here that you've seen before, okay? So that all of these signs, because together the signified and signifier is a sign, they exist in relation to each other because of their difference. Now, when we get to post-structuralism next time, they're going to key in and focus on this difference. So that's where the problem will be for them, or really, I should say, the liberating issue for them will be, is the in-betweenness, so to speak. But if you're focusing on this sign, if I can't highlight. If you're focusing on this particular sign right here, you don't, like I said, mansion or chateau, hovel, palace, whatever. You don't have to say the other words because the absence of those other signs are automatically present in the word itself. So when I say boy, the absence of girl is automatically present, if you will. When I say sun, we know it's not the moon, unless you're Petruchio trying to gaslight Kate in The Taming of the Shrew. So I hope that is not too difficult to understand, value and signification. He gives an example of sheep and mutton. So in English, especially English people, British people, if it's meat from what we would call a sheep on the table, they would often call it mutton, right? Rather than lamb, like here in the United States, we might call it lamb. But in French, there's only one word, mouton, right? Spelled differently than mutton. In other words, in English, we have the word sheep and we have the word lamb and we have mutton, but in French, there's only one word, right? So he's saying here the difference in value between sheep and mutton is due to the fact that sheep has beside it a second term that is mutton over here in English, while the French word does not. So that's value, right? And signification or meaning comes from the sign signified and signified together. So kind of, I hope, a simple concept. Yeah, so where is the Yeah, he begins to talk about arbitrariness in terms of writing, right? If you think about really alphabets, whether it's Chinese, Arabic, Western cultural, Romanized alphabet, they're all quite radically different and therefore are arbitrary for that culture. The Korean alphabet, the Japanese alphabet, the Chinese alphabet, they're not exactly alike. They may sort of, to those of us who don't understand, they may not, they may look similar, but they're radically different to all of those people who read and speak Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. Yeah, again, this is where he says, but in language, there are only differences without positive terms. That's, what had been said earlier. I'm going to try to find that for you. An unmotivated sign. And an unmotivated sign is something that, because words don't have any intention or, purpose, they just exist. They're unmotivated by what they, Barry has it here too, I believe. What they try to express. So here, this is on page, excuse me, 42 of Barry's chapter. It says, firstly, he, meaning Saussure, emphasized that the meanings we give to words are purely arbitrary and that these meanings are maintained by convention only, right? From culture to culture, time and era to era. Words, that is to say, are unmotivated signs, meaning that there is no inherent connection between the word and what it designates, right? The word hut, blah, 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 as I mentioned. So, yeah, and then I go on to ask, do you agree with Lévi-Strauss that myth constitutes a language? And we already talked about this in terms of the way that he tries to lay out his, structure and diachronic, synchronic examination of the Oedipus story. So you can agree with him or disagree with him if you choose that question. And then lastly, I ask, as I did with the new critical worksheet 1, a kind of generalized question about, what are limitations? So what might be some limitations and or contradictions of structuralism? In what ways do those limitations manifest themselves? So if there are limitations, how can we know them? For example, Peter Barry observes that for the structuralists, the culture we are part of can be read like a language, since culture is made up of structural networks which carry significance and can be shown to operate in a systematic way. That's from Barry, page 47. If that's true, that is, if culture is made up of structural networks, right? Okay. Who was doing the reading and how are these networks shown to operate? So, I was reminded of this book recently that came out, I think last year. I think her name is Kyla Schuler. About really feminism. The trouble with white women. And, a bit ironically, she's a white woman. She's actually a professor of women's studies, gender studies at Rutgers University. So this is The Trouble with White Women, a counter history of feminism. So if you're thinking about, that question, who is doing the reading and how are these networks, that is structural networks in culture, who's maintaining them and showing them and operating them. This book, published last year, is taking a stab at the problem with feminism as being a kind of bastion of white women's privilege, which is kind of important to think about. So in the introduction here, so you see last year, I think, October 2021. In the introduction, she begins with a section on feminist fault lines, which we'll talk about feminism later in the different waves or movements, but she's pointing out that it's not a monolithic thing, right? And these white women like Frances Harper and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the temperance and early women's rights movements to get the 1920 vote for women was largely a white female operation versus, say, like Black women of Harriet Beecher Stowe and Harriet Jacobs, right, and their self-determination. And therefore she's shaking it up, and rightly so, about who's had these structures of power, networks of power, right? And so that's kind of the question I'm asking. Okay, yeah, structures are great, they help us understand and order the world, but can we be locked into them, and then therefore are they limiting for us? So yeah, so choose one of those, and please provide your response in Word format by Monday, January 24th, a week from today, inside of Module 2. All right, folks, hope you're well, and we'll speak with you later. Bye.